So welcome to our virtual nErDCamp New Jersey session. I'm so glad that you guys are here to talk about your book journeys. So if you want to introduce yourselves and your books, we'll start with that.
Thank you so much for having us, Sarah. My name is Mayra Cuevas, and I am the author of the YA foodie rom-com, Salty Bittersweet. And it's about a girl who goes to, moves to Lyon, France, and she wants to win an apprenticeship in at a 3 Michelin starred kitchen. So there's a lot of like high stakes drama inside the world of haute cuisine and lots of awesome food descriptions. So the warning, the book will make you super, super hungry.
Yes, that was definitely my experience. And also the not wanting to put it down part. So you'll be binge reading and binge eating at the same time. So it's a great book. So hello everybody, I'm Ismee Williams. I'm the author of Water and May, and my new book is called This Train is Being Held. It is a New York City subway romance about Alex and Isa. So they are two Latinx teens from very different parts of Manhattan who meet and fall in love on a subway and deal with all sorts of terrible things that I do to them. So some people have said that it's a little bit like West Side Story, which I think is accurate, but that was not my intention. But I'm thrilled by the comparison, and I've even had multiple teachers tell me that they're using it as a companion read for Romeo and Juliet.
I was just thinking that's perfect.
Yes.
Wonderful. So we'll start with, I think, the first most basic question. What made you both decide to become writers?
So I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I grew up with great Latin American novels, you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. I read that book when I was like 12 years old. You know, I was reading like Isabel Allende, Casa de los Espíritus, and Manuel Seno Gandia, and some other amazing Puerto Rican and Latin American authors. And when you looked at a lot of their journeys, many of them were journalists before they became authors. So I wanted, you know, part of the reason why I became a journalist first is because that was the example that I saw growing up. That's kind of the thing that you did. And I just always knew since I was very young that I at some point in my life, I wanted to write books. Like that was definitely something I wanted to do. And there's just so much joy in being able to take all these kind of broken moments in your life and transmute them into art and make them something beautiful and pass some wisdom to the next generation.
That's very eloquently put, Mayra. I don't know how I'm going to go after that, but so I actually decided that I wanted to be a writer when I was on bed rest with my third child. So my journey is a little bit different. I am a pediatric cardiologist, and I knew from the time I was tiny that I wanted to be a doctor, just like my mother, just like my abuelo, who came from Cuba and had to study to be a doctor a second time so that he could get certified in this country. And my mother went to medical school in 1979 after applying for medical school 3 different times and being told to go to nursing school instead. But she didn't give up. And so I had this sort of like, oh, I'm going to be a doctor too. And I love being a doctor. But I love being a writer. And what made me want to be a writer was that I was on bed rest and I picked up a fiction novel for the first time in 11 years. And it just blew me away. It sort of opened.
What novel was that?
Right. Well, we'll get to that. I don't know if I'm going to share that right now, but I to make the story short, to survive being a doctor, I ended up building sort of a wall to keep in my own emotions and keep out other emotions, and to keep myself separated from all the really bad stuff that happens when you're a doctor that now everybody knows because everybody's watching the news with COVID. So to protect myself, I made this wall, and the wall was secure. It was fine until I read this book, and the book just punched a hole right through the wall. And I thought that's so powerful for, you know, something that somebody else did, a stranger. I don't know who this person is, but they wrote something and I read it and it just tore through my defenses and made me feel so many emotions. I remember my husband came home, I'm bawling, in the bed, and he was panicking like that there was something wrong with the baby. I was like, no, it's the book. It's so beautiful. So then that's what gave me sort of this passion. I wanted to write something to allow readers to feel intense emotion in a safe space, in a space where they were allowed and expected to feel intense emotion. So that was and Mayra's not going to let it go.
No, I will not.
The book it's a little embarrassing, but not too embarrassing, because I have to say I'm super excited for August to come. It was Twilight.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
No,
awesome.
it was that book, especially that second book where Edward goes away. I was like bawling. Oh my God. I was like, they're meant to be together. How could she tear them apart?
Oh, I love that. I think a lot of people had a similar experience. Why there are so many people excited for August now.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
So both of you have really cool like hooks in your book, you know, the subway story, the food. How did you come up with these ideas, and then how did you create your characters?
So I love cooking. And I if you go to my Instagram page, there's many photos that serve witness to that. And I began cooking again at a very young age, because both my grandmothers are excellent cooks. Like one of the ways that they show you how much they care about you and how much they love you is by making you amazing food. So I grew up in that very food nurturing environment, and my mom actually hates to cook.
Oh wow.
So it's different generation. So if I wanted to experiment in the kitchen or follow kind of in the footsteps of my abuelas, I had to do it on my own. So I grew up watching the Food Network, and I would watch the show, and then I would go and my mom would let me buy things at the grocery store, and I was in charge of making dinner for the family. So I would make.
She was like win-win, right?
I know, it's perfect win-win, right? So I started cooking very early. So I'm very passionate. I actually at one point considered becoming a chef.
Wow.
Like that was a potential career path. I'm very passionate about food. I love experimenting. Food is very creative, and I also find it very meditative, both cooking and baking. And I love learning new techniques, and there's something structural around it. Like you have to know technique, but within that technique you find a lot of room for creativity. And I feel like it's very similar to writing, because it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. Books have structure, but within that structure there's all this room for creativity. So they're very similar. And I also profoundly believe that food connects us as human beings. Like we come together at the table, everybody has a place at the table when you're offering people a meal, and there's space for conversation, there's space for connection. We have a lot of the memories that we cherish as human beings have food attached to them. So it's just a very important piece of the human experience.
And we see that now, right? With everybody in isolation, and all of the sourdough bread baking, and people making cookies, and Instagram is full of more food pictures than normal now.
Oh my God, yes, but it's been a bomb for people to be able to take their feelings of frustration, anxiety, these isolation, and make something, and not only make something but also share it with others. Right. Like for example, I've been baking up a storm, but most of my stuff goes to my neighbors, and that is today I took a pie to a friend of mine and her kids. So it's a way to keep our connections and to give of ourselves to others through something that we are making.
It's so true. Okay, so the idea for this train is being held. Backstory: I wrote Water in May. That was my debut. It was completely a finished product when I found my agent and then got the editor. they liked it. They said, what else do you have? What else can you write? And they said, we want something similar. And so I pitched them a couple of ideas, maybe I think like 3 or 4 ideas. And the pitches were basically 3 sentences each. So it was 1 page, like 3 little paragraphs. And they said, we want that one. And, you know, I had thought of the idea. I wanted to write about expectations and how expectations from society, from your friends, from your parents, and from yourself influence your own behavior and your sense of who you are, especially when you're a young person, when it is one of your primary psychological goals to figure out what your identity is as separate from your family, right? That's something that we all go through. And a lot of us as adults continue to deal with that, right? To address it. Like, how is my identity changing? Who am I? And so that was sort of the theme I wanted to deal with. And also because, you know, drawing off of my own experiences, you know, when I was little, it always drove me crazy that I was like this tiny girl and nobody ever took me seriously. You know, I was a very good student, but I always felt like I had something to prove, that they always would call on the boys first, or like, oh, you're a girl, you can't do math. And I think part of that is because of watching my mother and her struggles to get into medical school. And, you know, so I love when you surprise people, right? When you turn expectations on their head. So I wanted to play with all of those themes, those aspects in the book. And I wanted it to be a romance this time, because Water May is not a romance. Has similar themes in it, but romance is not a primary thread through the plot. I definitely wanted a romance. And so I thought, let me take 2 people who would otherwise not meet, who otherwise would not have their circles interact, even in a big city like Manhattan. And how would I have them meet? And I thought, you know, that's one of the things I love about the subway, that you see such a wide slice of the population in the city. They all ride the subway. And so that's where the idea came through. So I have Alex, who is a Dominican American from Washington Heights, which is a primarily Dominican neighborhood, but he splits his time because his parents are divorced and his father lives in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And Alex is a baseball prodigy, and his papi really wants him to go pro because he sees this as his chance for success. And his papi had played pro for a little bit. But Alex maybe wants to go to college, and he maybe wants to be a poet. So that was sort of like the turning the expectation on the head, because everybody thinks like, oh, a Dominican boy from Washington Heights, of course he's going to be a baseball player. But they don't think, oh, of course he wants to be a poet. And then Isa is blonde, lives on the Upper East Side, which is, you know, fancy place. And she goes to a private school, and she really wants to be a professional ballerina. And she sort of would look the part of a professional ballerina, but her mother hates that idea. She thinks that's not acceptable for a modern woman to be something so feminine, and that you would never be able to make a living doing that. She wants her to be something practical, you know, having come to this country from Cuba and dealt with poverty. And so she basically tells Isa, there's no way you're going to be able to be a professional ballerina. You have to be a doctor or something similar. And so that's Isa's struggle. So both of them have struggles with their parents. So sort of like dealing with the expectations of their parents, as well as expectations of what their friends and also society sees of them. So that was sort of the development of the characters and the thoughts behind.
So let's talk then like the nitty gritty stuff. How do you guys actually do your drafting?
So I am a plotter. I don't know how people pants. I really don't. I have no idea how that's done. Never been a pantser. I actually have a plotting form that I've developed over the years based on a couple of books. One is Story Engineering. Another one is Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And Story Genius. So those are my main 3 books that I use when I'm taking an idea, first of all, and deciding if that idea is viable for a whole novel, because not, you know, some ideas sound amazing at the beginning, but you just can't you can't develop them into 80,000 words, into like the structure of a book. So I want to make sure that that story is viable, that it's got legs, that you can keep it going and keep the readers engaged. So I will do a very detailed outline and make sure I got all of my plot points. And this is basically like a spine for the book. And once I have that developed, then I'll make changes as I go, but I have a general idea, like how the book how I want the book to end, what I want the midpoint to be, and what I want the tension points to be throughout the novel. Also, I work full time, so when I sit down to write, my writing has to be really focused, because I'll only have, I have to get up at 6 a.m. if I want, an hour and a half to write. And then I have to go to work. So writing in the evenings is not usually an option. So I'll sit down and I'll set some, as I'm developing a book, I'll set some targets to myself. I write forward. So usually that means that I'll just work on a full draft without going back and making changes. I'll just keep writing and see how the story continues to develop. And as that happens, the characters kind of tell you what they want. They start talking to you and things begin to change organically. So you adapt that spine that you have created, you kind of adapt as you go. So that's pretty much in terms of craft, that's usually how I write.
So I'm a little bit similar. I definitely plot, but I do very broad strokes. I've read plotting books, and I've read 2 of the ones that Mayra read, and they just don't stick for me. As I'm reading them, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. Yes. And then when I put them down, I completely forget what they told me. But what I do remember, I use, I guess, what's called Lynn Oliver from SCBWI taught me this in a breakout session at one year. Basically, it's like a screenwriter's, the 3-act idea. So just, I need to have my characters. I need to know what my characters want and what they need. And hopefully those things are going to conflict. And I need to understand what their arc is going to be, both sort of an action arc and their emotional arc. Mm-hmm. And then I usually start with like little note cards that I think are going to be like scene ideas. And so for this train is being held, I brainstormed, what are some really cool things that could happen on the subway, or things that I've seen. Like, so I was like, okay, there's got to be a scene where we have, dancers on the subway, like for money. We got to have a scene with some homeless people. We've got to have, like I just wrote a list, and then I thought, okay, well, what could happen with like the 2 lovers? I'm like, well, there's got to be a kiss scene, and how am I going to do that? And so I brainstorm, I write down my little note cards, and then I sort of have to put them into place and figure out, well, where would this go? Where would this go? And then once I have that with my note cards, I write an outline, and I use Scrivener, which I find very helpful. And I wouldn't say I go always forward. I do something that's similar to what Gary D. Schmidt says that he does, which is that as I write a chapter, I'll finish writing a chapter, and then I'll start back at the beginning. So like if I write part of a chapter and then the next morning I'm finishing that chapter, I have to start at the beginning. So I'll be editing the first part of that chapter before I finish it. And then I go on. And then sometimes it depends. What I do like to do, which I do find helpful for any writers out there, is even if I finish a chapter or finish a scene, you're sort of on a roll. So I'll write maybe a paragraph or 2, even if it's very rough, of the next scene or of the next chapter, so that the next time I sit down to write and I have no distractions, it's easier to get into it. I can be like, oh yeah, this is where I was going. Because sometimes, and I've just been dealing with this editing another manuscript, if you don't look at it for a long period of time, and I work too, I don't work full time. I work part-time seeing patients, but I have 3 kids. Like life has a lot of distractions, right? So there might be weeks, sometimes months go by before I can get back to something. And if it's been too long, I actually have to start at the beginning and read everything to really sort of immerse myself in the world and my characters' thoughts and feelings so that I can get back into that groove.
So how did you each get your agents and then sell your book?
So my journey to signing out with an agent was super rocky and filled with lots of soul crushing rejection. The first manuscript that I went out on query with, it was a fantasy manuscript, and looking back, it was just awful. But at the time, of course, I didn't get how awful it was. And I think it got like 200 rejections from agents. And you know, some people now, they tell me, oh, I've queried about 10 agents, 20 agents. I'm like, oh, please give me a break.
Keep going,
like, you know,
keep going.
Yeah, get back to me when you got at least 50 on your list. So I did that fantasy manuscript rejected. So then I wrote something else, something completely different. And my second manuscript that I wrote actually got me signed on with my agent, Saritza Hernandez from Corviciero, who I absolutely love. But then that manuscript went out on submission and it didn't sell. And that is not something that a lot of writers and authors talk about, that you think you get an agent and that's it. You get your agent, it's the book contract is going to happen, right? And sometimes it doesn't. Like sometimes the book just can't find a home. It's not the right time for it. You know, this particular manuscript, I think it needs to be rewritten as a middle grade because it was really young YA. And then so I just kept writing, and I wrote another manuscript, which is what eventually became Salty Bittersweet, and that one sold right away. So my advice for all of you future published authors out there is keep writing and just write something else. Don't get stuck on the same book, you know, because it's good to have another manuscript in the drawer kind of ready to go if the one that you are focusing just it doesn't sell or you just can't get representation for it.
I agree. So Water and May is my second manuscript. My first manuscript was a paranormal romance, kind of like Twilight, but no vampire. But so I spent years. I know. I should dig it out. But it's not vampires. It's like different types of beings. But I spent 5 years, I feel like I wrote that in 3 months. Then I spent 4 years figuring out how to write and how to get an agent and edit. And I took some night classes. I paid an independent editor at one point, which was expensive, but it was Laura Ruby, who at the time wasn't super famous. And her feedback was so spot on. And I used her outline of how she delivers feedback even today in my own writer's critique group, just the way that she did step by step, and the pointers she gave me was excellent. Cause I honestly, I would have done one of those limited residency MFAs, but I didn't have the time. I had 3 little kids and I was working. So, but I love to learn. I like taking classes. So I would have completely done that. And so then after spending such a long time doing that, I sat down and I wrote Water in May, and that took me about 4 months. And then I tidied it up a little bit, and then I got an agent within 3 months. But with my first manuscript, I got easily like 200 rejections from agents. And so, but one of the agents who rejected me, I did send it back to that agency, and that person, who is Jim McCarthy, picked up Water in May, which was lovely. And then, so this is my 4th manuscript, because I wrote a manuscript as we were selling this one that was a fantasy. And my editors at Abrams took a look at it because they had a right of first refusal for my second book. It wasn't a 2-book deal. And they said, you know, we really like this, but it's too similar to some other fantasies that we already have, right? So that's another thing sometimes people don't realize, that you know, it's like every publisher has a menu. They have to have a menu of with variety on it to offer booksellers. And so they said, we really liked Water in May, and we don't have any authors who write sort of urban with diverse characters. Can you give us something more similar to Water in May? So that's when I came up with this idea.
So once your books were with an editor and in a publishing house, how did you work with the editors, and did you work with inclusivity readers too?
Oh my God, yes.
Good question.
What a nightmare. So Ismee knows the whole story because she had to dry my tears. When I got my inclusive, at that time we're calling them sensitivity readers, and they do not hold back. Let me tell you, they basically.
But that's what you want too, right?
The what?
It's what you want. You want them to identify any potential areas of controversy, or so you can address them before it gets published.
But it was pretty brutal. So let me back up a little bit. So we got an offer with Blank HarperCollins, which is they're a great imprint. I had a wonderful experience with the release of my book, and I cannot say enough good things about them. They were wonderful with marketing, they were great throughout the entire editorial process. So it was a very, very positive experience for me. And it's a small team, so I got to work with everybody within the imprint. Basically, when they received the manuscript, we did some small editorial changes. My agent, it's very involved in the editorial process, so we had already worked on the manuscript quite a bit before it went out, so it was like super clean when it went out. So the editorial changes were fairly small. So we did a couple of two rounds of editorial changes before I went to copy edit, and then after, which is actually not that much. And then in copy edit, we went back and forth on some things. For example, like what words, there's about 6 languages in the book, so we needed to figure out like what words we were gonna italicize and that kind of thing. And how, if we were gonna do a glossary in the back for kitchen terms, which we ended up doing. And then there's things like author's notes and the acknowledgments and, all these things you've been dreaming of for years, like the dedication, so all that stuff. So that was fun. And of course, in the middle of this came the sensitivity report. That was part of that initial editorial process. And basically, your imprint will hire someone to go in through line by line and point out anything that they may find an issue, or that others may see as an issue in the book. So that's have to do things with race, culture, language. There's a broad number of things. And for me, it was really difficult because I put into this book a lot of my cultural views and cultural background and the way that I see the world as a Puerto Rican woman, born and raised on the island, living in the States, coming from a minority background. And there were multiple things in the report that I felt were questioning almost like my identity as coming from that perspective. So yeah, it took a lot of, talking things through with Ismee, who was like holding my hand through the whole process, and gaining some perspective and just really looking at it from the view that this is someone who's trying to help me and make sure that there's not going to be any issues with the book, like, that are coming down the road. And after the book comes out and the advanced reader copies go out and you start seeing some of the reviews and some of the things that people are saying, I was thankful that I went through and I made all the changes that I made, because people can really go in and just start picking and anything in your book. So you just want to make sure, you've taken care of these things before publication.
Yeah, and so my for this train is being held, I will say that we did, so some of the elements in this book, I've talked about difficult family relationships, sort of parents and expectations. There's also mental illness. Issa's brother and her mother both suffer from bipolar disorder. And then there's the issue of Alex being a person of color and having to sort of navigate that in a world where people see him as this really strong, athletic young man who and they sometimes perceive him, or strangers will often perceive him as threatening. And so that was one of the sort of these expectations, even though he's so sweet and inside. And that was one of his sort of wounds, that people just assume that he isn't what he actually really is because of the way he looks. And so I had 3 sensitivity, inclusivity readers. For the mental illness, I had friends who are psychiatrists and psychologists who I worked with as I was writing. But when the book was finally done, when we were on one of our last edits, we got an independent psychologist to read it from the mental illness standpoint to make sure that I wasn't making any inappropriate comments or insinuations, which was really, really important, because it's a very important topic. And, it's from the point of view of the sibling, right, whose family is dealing with it, which is something like 50% of adolescents are going to be affected by mental illness, whether it's their own or a close family member or friend of theirs. So this is a big issue. I wanted to make sure that we got it right. And I do have bipolar disorder in my family, but I'm not from the perspective that Isa had. And then I had 2 other sensitivity readers reading for Alex, because I am half Cuban. My mother is Cuban and she is an immigrant, but I am clearly white. And I did not grow up facing the types of prejudice that Alex faced. So I wanted to make sure that I was being very sensitive about that and not misrepresenting anything. So I found somebody who is very like Alex, a young man in his 20s who is Dominican American, who grew up in Washington Heights, who's now out of college. I had him read it for authenticity. And then we had somebody who's within the young adult community, who's another young adult author who does inclusivity reads, reading from that perspective, sort of being much more aware and in tune with potential areas of controversy, I guess. And so I made some mild changes for, in all of those areas. But actually, it's funny. One of the big changes that I made is that initially the reader also does not know that Isa is half Cuban. So Alex does not realize that, because he assumes, again, it's all about expectations. He knows she's a dancer and she's blonde and she lives on the Upper East Side. He has no clue that she's Cuban until a pivotal scene when they meet up with his friends and they start speaking Spanish in front of her, and not realizing that she knows what they're saying. But so that was the scene where the reader also knows. And so one of my inclusivity readers said, oh, no, you need to tell the reader right in the beginning, because otherwise they're not going to like Isa, or they're going to question, her thoughts. And also the mother, like that you didn't realize that the mother was an immigrant. She was just sort of this kind of nasty person and you didn't understand where the behavior was coming from. So that was actually a really important change that I made. So now sort of Isa's second scene, it's all out there so that the reader understands her background.
That's so interesting, like the 2 different experiences that you had, but in the end, both ended up making the books better for it.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of publishers now have added that extra level of, beyond your critique group or having, people read for you. Like now the sensitivity or the inclusivity readers are providing that feedback, though I'm sure it is difficult to internalize.
It's so important though, because the point is that, you would think, at least this was my case, I would never intentionally write something that would harm another. But the point is that it's like I have a blind side, right? I have my own bias. I might not be aware of what I'm doing, which is why you have to take somebody who has an experience that's very different from yours, who might have an experience more similar to your character, to look at it from that point of view, because otherwise I'm unable to see it.
Right. We see our perspective. It's really hard to see somebody else's.
Well, and also, I mean, when you're talking about a book, there's so many different elements that you, as an author, are trying to polish before this book, goes to print, that it's easy to miss something. It's like we're not, like Ismee said, we're not intentionally trying to create any harm with our words or with something that we missed, but it is so easy to miss stuff. you know, things and important things like ableist language, you know, or colorism, or all of these things that are now are that the spotlight is kind of being put on some of these things. And you know, we all have different life experiences. So for what one person may consider divisive or hurtful or, you know, harmful in any way, for me it's not. So
Right.
it, you know, it's looking at these things from all different angles. And for I you know, I'm on submission right now with another book, and that I co-wrote with another author, a dear friend of mine, and we've actually talked about asking the publisher to hire two readers, sensitivity readers for it, because we really, it's a book that deals with a lot of social issues, so we really need to make sure like we get it right, and we welcome that feedback.
That's awesome. So I think before we wrap up, I would ask you, what's your advice for people who want to write? Because you both work, you both have a lot going on. I love that you mentioned that life has a lot of distractions. So what's your advice?
I would say, you know, Mayra said at the beginning, keep writing. I mean, and don't give up. So that's another thing. I, you know, it took my journey, it was 7 years until I became published. And I went to, what I was able to do was go to writers conferences. The SCBWI was fantastic. And you go to these conferences and you get to hear amazing authors who are super famous. Everybody knows their name, and they're giving you keynote speeches. And then you hear their journeys about how they spent 8 years, you know, falling asleep on the couch at night after their accounting job or what have you, because they couldn't let it go and they just kept writing. And it gives you the sort of the fuel to also keep going, to know that if you're passionate about it, if this is your passion, if you don't want to let it go, just keep going. Don't give up.
So I have a few different pieces of advice. The first one being, don't quit your day job. Because
also that, yeah, don't do that.
That book contract, unless you got some amazing deal, it's not going to pay the mortgage.
Yeah, no.
This is just fun, you know, vacation money, right? And you know, you have to be really resilient in this industry, because there is a lot of rejection, and the rejection never ends. Like, you know, after you know, you spend years getting rejected by agents, and then you get rejected by publishers, and then you finally publish, and then your book comes out, and the reviews come out, and then you get rejected by reviewers, right? So it it never ends. The rejection never ends. And, you know, it never gets any less, like, just awful. It's soul crushing.
Yeah, that's true. Just don't read the reviews. Don't read the reviews.
Yes, do not read the reviews. I made that mistake once and never again. So you have to be really resilient. You have to trust your own talent, and, you know, be passionate about what you're writing, be passionate about the story that you're telling, you know, and if you want to say something, put it in the story. Like, we all love reading stories from people who are passionate about what they're writing about. And, you know, that whole thing about rejection brings me to my next point of advice, is like, you have to build a writing community around you, and a supportive community. Like, my writing community, you know, I have a group of writers here in Atlanta that we support each other. We go on retreats. We do critique sessions. We meet up for, you know, cocktail hour, and we support each other, you know. And also I have Ismee and I are both members of Las Musas, which is a collective of Latina children's book writers, and that's another amazing writing community of just people who are boosting each other up, and, you know, and giving each other support. So a community, building a community before you get an agent, before you get published, it is incredibly important.
That's awesome.
Totally agree.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us. This was so great. Thank you for organizing this.
It was great. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great meeting you.
Good luck to everybody out there.
Yes.
Keep writing.
Thank you.
And reach out. Both Ismee and I are on social media. So if you have any questions, please reach out. We love answering any questions. We also have webinars, free live webinars that we teach. You just go to lasmusasbooks.com and it's on our webinar series tab.
I will add that to the document that we'll post with this.
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.